Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and an honor, really, to be able to address this audience on this important topic. The concept of full employment emerged from the intellectual climate of the immediate years following the Second World War. And while I will come eventually to the European crisis, I hope you will permit me to reach it by easy stages with a discussion that begins quite far back in history so that we can begin to see how this idea took root in the United States and later on in Europe. The, of course, founding conceptual and intellectual basis occurred during the 1930s. And while we in memory often give credit to the work of John Maynard Keynes, whose general theory of employment, interest, and money was published in 1936, in fact, a great many things had been going on before Keynes in the United States in the development of the New Deal, beginning in March of 1933. And I want to talk about the New Deal because it created an institutional basis for the American economy that largely still exists today, and whose importance, I think, is not adequately understood. The New Deal was a project in social construction and also, if you like, in post-war reconstruction. Which war? Well, actually, the war in question was the American Civil War, which had ended almost 70 years before Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933. But in that 70 years, the United States had suffered from a vast internal division, with industrial development going on in the North and Midwest, expansion out to the West, but the South, the old Confederacy, mired in poverty and underdevelopment of a very dramatic form. It was full of malnutrition, illiteracy, agricultural stagnation. And the New Deal represented the first effort to integrate the continental economy on a substantial basis. Began with the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, dealing with the problems of the farmers whose economic basis had collapsed in the Depression. It included the Tennessee Valley Authority, which harnessed the hydroelectric power of the region and began to give it an industrial base. The Rural Electrification Administration, which took over from private utilities that were unwilling to provide electrical power outside of the dense cities that had a profitable customer base. The Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration, which between them created millions of jobs, paved about 1 million kilometers of roads, built 1,000 airfields, rebuilt every rural school in America, gave us the Lincoln Tunnel in New York and the Chicago waterfront and a host of other major infrastructure projects which we still enjoy today. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which tackled the Dust Bowl of the Plain States in those years and planted over 1 billion trees. The Writers and Artist Projects, which employed Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. There was a massive banking reform, the Glass-Steagall Law, that separated out commercial and investment banks, and the enactment of federal deposit insurance that stabilized the banking sector. There was the National Labor Relations Act, which facilitated the unionization of the industrial workforce. There was the establishment of a minimum wage in the United States on a continental basis, very low at first, but nevertheless significant if you were let's say, a female worker or a worker in an impoverished region, there was the enactment of Social Security in 1935, providing for the first time a national foundation for stable retirements. And as the decade progressed and war loomed in Europe, the foundation of the New Deal, which also included, by the way, the construction of several aircraft carriers that proved very useful at the Battle of Midway, the New Deal provided the foundation for the vast mobilization that brought America into the Second World War, and indeed for the Manhattan Project. And at the end of this remarkable period of national construction, the question of what would be the core values, the core objectives of a national economic policy going forward was posed to the United States Congress. And after a debate in 1944 over the Full Employment Bill, what emerged was the Employment Act of 1945, which gave as its core objectives not full employment. That phrase did not make it into the final bill, but maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. In other words, that the objective of economic policy would be to sustain the employment and productive base and the living standards of the population. And that objective was carried forward under the imperatives of the Cold War, a period in which liberalism was sustained by the competition and the threat of communism, something I think that was not unfamiliar here, right? And which provided a kind of imperative to maintain a steady rate of economic progress and a high level of employment. You already alluded to that in your opening comments. But there were unfinished projects of the New Deal, which were taken up again in the 1960s, most effectively in the administration of Lyndon Johnson under the rubric of the Great Society. And here I could go into a laundry list of legislation that I won't trouble you with, but perhaps the most important and central additions to the development of what Europeans call a welfare state in America was the creation of a national health insurance program for the elderly, Medicare, and a program which for which people below a certain means test were eligible, which is called Medicaid. Two institutions which again continue to the present day. And this epic, which was an epic of the construction of a national economic community with continent-wide stabilizing institutions, I think continued into the 1970s, but basically culminated in a legislative expression in 1978, which was called the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. Not a law which carried a great deal of weight going forward, but rather one which I think expressed the ethos of a moment which was coming to an end. I say this with some ambivalence because this was a law in whose drafting I participated personally. And my role as a staff member for the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives at the time was to write a section of the law which nobody thought was important, which was the section dealing with the central bank. And that is why the Federal Reserve today operates under what is called a dual mandate, full employment and price stability, actually written into the law in the preamble of the Humphrey-Hawkins Act as full employment, balanced growth, and reasonable price stability. A pragmatic and flexible legal mandate, which has not always been interpreted in a pragmatic and flexible way, but nevertheless. Still, as I say, this was the end of an era. By the 1970s, the system so constructed and the ideals set out over the previous 40 years were under enormous stress in the United States as in Europe, and for similar reasons. the shock of higher energy prices, the destabilization coming from a range of sources, and the threat of inflation prompted a radical change in the prevailing and predominant body of economic ideas. And that change, which we now know as neoliberalism, became politically dominant beginning in the UK in 1979 and with the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States in 1980. A sequence of revolutions, the Reagan Revolution, the monetarist counter-revolution, the supply-side revolution, which held that if you simply cut taxes on the wealthiest segment of the society, they would take care of the need for investment and saving growth. One thing you can be sure of is that when you hear the word revolution repeated incessantly, you probably haven't got one. And the Reagan Revolution was, in fact, a greatly overstated phenomenon. It did involve the use of the financial power that the United States had at that time to save the worldwide position of the dollar. It did entail a very important attack on the industrial basis of the strength of the Democratic Party, the trade unions, and an accommodation to the rising position of Japan, Korea, and later on of China in the world industrial system and their position as a supplier of industrial goods to the United States. And all of these things did lead to an enormous change in the way in which the United States presented itself to the rest of the world. We went from being the country that expressed the values of the New Deal and the emergent middle class in a democratic setting to a country that expressed itself as the champion of free market individualism, deregulation, privatization, and so forth in the conduct of economic policy. But in spite of all of that, the period of high reaction in the formation of American policy was relatively short. It ran really just through the first few years of the 1980s. And the core institutions which had built the country over many decades remained largely intact. And over the succeeding years, in certain respects, they were even strengthened in various places. In the late 1990s, we expanded something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which provides a certain level of wage insurance to low-wage workers. In the 2000s, even under the very reactionary administration of George W. Bush, the coverage of Medicare was expanded in such a way as to add in drug coverage in a way which greatly enriched the pharmaceutical companies, but nevertheless provided a benefit that was not there previously. And of course, in the last several years, we've had this rather crazy quilt expansion of the health care coverage that is known as Obamacare. The result is that the United States continued to have an integrated continental economy with a large federal government and strong stabilizing capacity at the federal level. Meanwhile, in Europe, of course, post-war institutions were built under many of the same conceptual foundations and on many of the similar institutional lines that delivered security and employment. And as you said, in the 1970s, an unemployment number of 50,000 in Finland was considered to be a shocking deviation from the previously established post-war norm. And Finland was not alone in this. Most European, certainly North European countries were accustomed to unemployment rates which were practically invisible. 1% and 2% was not unusual up through the early 1970s. But these institutions were not built into the design of economic integration at the continental level as this began to be developed in the 1980s and 1990s. Instead, they were vitiated to a very substantial extent by the combination of open borders, arbitrary and capricious fiscal accounting rules, the Maastricht guidelines, and a monetarist central bank charter. In other words, a continental construction that was, from an ideological point of view, the mirror of its time, framed by the dominant economic ideas of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, right? Which was the notion that in the final analysis, markets would make these decisions, governments should be restrained in what they should do, and adjustment would occur through the adjustment of relative prices. And what happened? The result was that once the euro came into existence, fundamental forces went to work which could not be controlled. And those fundamental forces were the underlying industrial competitiveness of the German economy and associated Northern European economies, which drew economic activity into the north center of Europe. And not just industrial activity, agricultural activity as well. Countries like Belgium become exporters of lettuce to the south of Europe. An absurd proposition on the face of it. But there it is. A concentration of industrial and economic competitiveness in certain regions, combined with the German low-wage strategy that was put in place some years ago, assured a buildup of an unsustainable financial relationship between the north and the south of Europe. Trade surpluses on the one side, trade deficits on the other, credits on the one side, debts on the other, building up to the point at which they become immensely vulnerable to a crisis. Now, the European illusion, repeated endlessly during this period, was that employment could nevertheless be assured by flexibility, by flexibilization. I came to Europe many times during this period, and I was always impressed by the fact that you couldn't turn on the television without somebody talking about the need for greater flexibility. Right? And pointing to the United States as a model of flexibility. It was interesting and completely without foundation in evidence, experience, or ongoing fact. Indeed, the Scandinavian experience over many years clearly demonstrated that the opposite was the case. That when you pursued a policy of reasonable wage compression, actually preventing the installation of low-wage businesses on your national territories, what you got out of that was induced productivity gains. Right? The bad businesses moved out and the good ones came in. And the result of that was that your productivity rose and your standard of living rose. And over many decades, since the 1930s, the Scandinavian countries went from being, I guess, about average by European standards to being at the top of the world's living scale. Fact that you all know, and this was accomplished without trade protection in the context of an open economic environment. It was the LO model. Wren and Meidner, two great economists, who saw this would be the case. And what this did was to make it possible to redeploy labor and to support support a large public sector. I have some work with a young economist now at the OECD named Enrique Garcilaso, who confirms this as a general rule. If the flexibilization thesis were correct, it would be the case that countries with higher levels of wage inequality would have lower unemployment rates. But the reverse is systematically true at the national and at the regional level. There's a gradient from the north to the south of Europe in this respect. And it's also not true, as many people claim, that European wages are more egalitarian than the United States, because the measurements overlook the fact that there are vast inequalities across the countries of Europe, between Germany and Poland, or Norway and Spain. And when you take those into account, in fact, the inequality numbers don't look that much in the European favor. It may, in fact, favor the United States on wages alone. So is wage flexibility the secret of American high employment in the period before the crisis? No, it's not. Now, it is true that in one important and catastrophic area, the United States went toward the market model with a vengeance. And that was in the deregulation in the 1990s up to 2000, and the de-supervision in the 2000s of the banking sector, of the financial sector. An absolutely catastrophic set of decisions that gave us, our banks and our shadow banks, the ability to originate many millions of highly corrupt mortgages, fraudulent mortgages, mortgages extended to people who it was known would never pay them. It would have to be refinanced or they would default. And that these mortgages were then packaged in extraordinarily dubious ways, rated by extremely avaricious and gullible ratings agencies into AAA securities, which were then sold to a trusting world investment community. Right? And that this led, once it was exposed, to an epic financial disaster, which cost us millions of jobs, has cost the homes of millions of households and families in the United States, and has wiped out a very large part of what had been seen as the middle class wealth position, because like all middle class societies, a great part of the value of people's assets was in the accumulated wealth of their homes, accumulated price of their homes, and that has substantially gone away, while destabilizing the world's economy and financial system. But in the larger consequences of this, the United States nevertheless had the advantages of its unified economic structure. There is partly in this the fact that the victims include, while they include millions of householders, and there are tens of millions who are in trouble in one form or another, there are also scores of millions who are not. And those who are in trouble adjust over time. Either they continue to pay their mortgages and the mortgages are paid down, or they default, in which case in most states they are out of debt after a short period of time and simply have to find another place to live. But, for example, the deposit insurance system in the United States worked and was extended as necessary at the peak of the crisis. And the actions of the central bank, which were extraordinarily aggressive in extending loans to financial institutions and to central banks around the world, were able to forestall a global panic. All of that's true. But I think the most important fact about what happened in the United States was not these deliberate actions of policymakers in the heat of the crisis, but the stabilizing effect of pre-existing institutions. We call the automatic stabilizers, which operate in two ways. One, they reduce the tax burden. As people's incomes fall, their tax bills fall more than proportionately, leaving more money in their pockets, and they increase transfer payments to provide a replacement for lost income. This is true of unemployment insurance, it's true of Social Security and Social Security disability payments, it's true of food assistance, it's true of a whole host of public programs whose share of the US economy went up by something like 8 percentage points in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, with the result that while employment and output fell by about 10%, incomes only fell by maybe 2 percentage points. And under those circumstances, life goes on. Moreover, did the federal government suffer a financial strain in providing this stabilization? Not at all. On the contrary, as you can see from the interest rate paid by the U.S. federal government, this is something that happened seamlessly at this particular time. It is true that we have seen a political reaction to this development. Here in the United States, as everywhere else, the forces of austerity decry it. We have our deficit hawks and our deficit hysterics who are demanding that the very programs that saved us now be cut back and even dismantled. And this is what some of the discussion over the so-called fiscal cliff, which is occurring at the moment, is all about. The Republican leader of the Senate a few days ago put on the table his program, which included a significant overtime rollback in the value of Social Security benefits and a partial privatization of the Medicare program by increasing the eligibility age. It's all an attack on the stabilizing institutions. But they haven't prevailed yet. And I would argue that the relative stability of conditions in the United States is a sign of the enduring success of this institutional framework. And I would also suggest that the outcome of the election is an interesting endorsement on the part of the American people of these institutions under which they live. Even though the president did not aggressively defend them, the public nevertheless saw the choice that they were facing and chose the party that they thought would mount a sterner and stiffer defense of the existing institutional structure. It was, in fact, the first election since the crisis in any major country, maybe in any country, but certainly in any major country that I'm aware of, in which the incumbent government was returned to office. Now, in Europe, what has happened? The financial crisis was vectored in from the United States. We originated it and we passed it on to you because Europeans had bought many of the toxic assets that the American banking system had generated and was selling to them in the guise of AAA-rated securities based upon U.S. mortgages. And when it was realized that these things were toxic, that they were going to take enormous losses, then, of course, investors looked at their own portfolios and asked, what else is out there that might cause us some trouble? And they said, well, we've got these debts of the weak sovereigns in Europe. And they could get into trouble, and they sold them off. And that sell-off occurs beginning in late 2008, early 2009, and it's a consequence of these global financial developments. It's not an isolated event. It's not the sudden discovery that that Greece is a country with a weak tax system and a bloated public sector. This was not a secret to anybody who ever had gone there, right? And it was not a secret to the European authorities either, as I think an investigation would reveal. It was not a secret that Spain had a residential housing boom or that Ireland had a commercial real estate bubble. Come on. People knew this. But it is a characteristic of the credit cycle that when in the expansion phase, loans are made to dubious borrowers, and then in the panic, their vices are suddenly discovered and the credits are withdrawn. Right? It happens everywhere. It's happened in the United States. It's what happened in Europe. But here's the difference. In the United States, the troubled debtors, largely homeowners, were spread all over the place. And as I said before, they had the capacity to suffer or adjust over time without destabilizing the system as a whole. But in Europe, the troubled debtors are in fact states. And if they weren't states to begin with, they became states quite quickly when governments such as Ireland's were obliged to assume responsibility for debts that had been incurred in the private sector. And so the core mechanism of the states became at risk in consequence of the crisis in a way that was not so true in the United States. That is to say, core public services, civil service salaries, and pensions all came under threat. And these were not going to be sustained by stabilizing forces from the center. Moreover, it didn't happen everywhere, at least not everywhere with the same intensity. It happened in parts of Europe and not in other parts. So what's the consequence? The consequence, I think, is clear. It is a geographic and national polarization, which is going on now in Europe, and that conduces to a very unfortunate politics of virtue and vice. It's very easy to come to confuse economic with moral and even religious concepts. People are easily led to believe that hard work and thrift produce surpluses, that sunshine and soft living produce deficits and debt. Things that we would instantly recognize as racial stereotypes if they were applied to African states or in the North American context to ethnic groups, become common rhetorical currency. And the debtors are admonished to be better people, to reform themselves, to adjust, to tighten their belts, to work harder, to cut their wages, to forego their pensions. And in doing this, the creditors slit their own throats and deprive themselves of their own markets. And nothing is solved because the debts and the deficits don't go away. The reality is that there can be no surplus anywhere without a corresponding deficit somewhere else. Balance sheets have two sides, assets and liabilities. Debts, furthermore, that cannot be paid won't be paid. And there is in history no end to debt crisis until the creditors take a realistic position and mechanisms are put in place to stabilize the incomes of the entire community and to reform the financial mechanisms so that these reckless cycles of extension and retreat do not continue to occur. In 1919, and I'll close with a somewhat extended set of quotations, but I think they're appropriate. John Maynard Keynes wrote in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, if we take the view that for at least a generation to come, Germany cannot be trusted with at least a modicum of prosperity, that while all our recent allies are angels of light, all our recent enemies, Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, and the rest, are children of the devil, that year by year Germany must be kept impoverished and her children starved and crippled, then heaven help us all. And again, a debtor nation does not love its creditors, and it is fruitless to expect feelings of goodwill toward ourselves, British, from France, Italy, and Russia towards this country, if their future development is stifled for many years to come by the annual tribute which they must pay. And again, the whole position is in the highest degree artificial, misleading, and vexatious. We shall never be able to move again unless we can free our limbs from these paper shackles A general bonfire is so great a necessity that unless we can make of it an orderly and good-tempered affair in which no serious injustice is done to anyone, it will, when it comes at last, grow into a conflagration that may destroy much else as well. I invite you, it's not difficult to draw the parallels that are fitting with the present situation. The mechanics are essentially exactly the same. You said at the beginning that, I guess it was you who said at the beginning that the consequences would be increased poverty and deep social crisis. I want to suggest something a little more severe than that. Okay? I think it is not too difficult, if you go to Greece today or to Spain, to imagine what the end game looks like, the end game of the path on which Europe is now progressing. It's not so long ago and not so very far away. There was a very successful middle-income country, a federation that fell apart. It was called Yugoslavia. Right? I know something about it. My brother served there for 5 years, from 1993 to 1998, as the first United States ambassador to Croatia. The falling apart of Yugoslavia was not something that happened cleanly on national lines. Within the emergent countries, there were sub-countries and wannabe countries and enclaves that broke apart as well. And the level of violence escalated extremely rapidly. It was not age-old ethnic hatreds, but new crimes that were committed that brought about the debacle that occurred there. And I don't think it's very much of an exaggeration to say that one can see some of the same processes beginning to take shape in Greece, and perhaps also in other parts of Europe, afflicted by this untreated cancer of the Eurozone debt crisis. There's another model out there that you can consider. Much better model, actually, when you think about it. Also not so far away and not so long ago, and that's Czechoslovakia. And what happened there was a relatively successful resolution of irreconcilable differences. But you have to ask yourself, how was it achieved? It was achieved by a high order of political and moral leadership, which the Czechs were fortunate enough to have. And you have to ask yourself, would you find that anywhere in the larger European setting now? I'm not so sure you have a good answer, an emergent answer to that question. And if you want something better than either of those two outcomes, then it seems to me that it's worth asking, how do you get the kind of solidarity that enables you to have a sustainable economic and financial and human social relationship across the Europe that currently exists and that you might like to preserve? And for that, I suggest it is a question of institutions. It's a question of setting a course and building them over a long period of time, of experimenting aggressively, but above all, of beginning with the change of ideas, with an understanding of what you need to do. And I suggest that really does need to become, as the New Deal came in the United States, from the wealthier and more successful parts of the society. The New Deal could never have emerged from the American South. It actually came out of New York and Wisconsin. Right? It has to come from an expression of moral leadership from those who are in a position to exercise it. Thanks very much. Pleasure talking to
Well, thank you very much. Real tour de force through the past decades or past century of international policies and links between politics and economics. And I do have to say about where you ended up in this Greek question that when the debates go about should we cut off the Greece at the moment, one has to ask after that, well, isn't Greece a European question after that anymore? I mean, it still remains something that European Union has to solve, whether it is in the euro or out, but it doesn't disappear. And I also have used this comparison to the Yugoslavian question and how helpless Europeans felt at the state of a crisis and needed Americans to come and aid them to solve that question as well. I would perhaps wish that Europe could be in a better shape to cope with its own problems at the moment. But we go forward with economics, financial theories, full employment, modern money. These are the themes Professor L. Randall Wray has tackled in his research and his work. He comes from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and is known to develop further the tradition of Keynes, Hyman P. Minsky, and Wayne Goodley. He's also very active in participating in debates of economics, very active in internet, in blogs and so on, but very well known. Please, the floor is yours.